This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this critical thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright everybody, before we begin with today's critical thought, a few things. I've been hearing some comments about my voice and the picture not really syncing well, so I raised a little bit of the frames per second up on OBS to see if that helps. Let me know what you think. If it's still acting a little slow, I'll try raising up a little bit more. Now, as a bit of serendipity today, Microsoft had a major announcement regarding their new Netflix-style streaming service, the Xbox Game Pass. I made a post about it on Game Wisdom, and I will be dedicating tomorrow's critical thought to it. So even though I said this week was going to be a week of Nintendo, we're going to have to change the plans. But I got a really good one for you today. As we talked about yesterday, Nintendo has made some mistakes over the years. Depending on who you talk to, it could be a few mistakes to a lot. But for today's critical thought, I want to talk to you about their biggest. And this is not hyperbole. This is arguably the biggest mistake Nintendo has ever made. And as I said earlier, this is what made them essentially lose the throne of the game industry. And as we talked about yesterday with the critical thought about Nintendo's history, and if you missed that one, there should be a link to it in the notes below. Nintendo basically took control of the game industry in 1985 with the success of the NES. When Sega entered the market with the Sega Genesis, this created a very bitter rivalry and a hardware arms race between the two. Sega went with the 16-bit, Nintendo countered with the SNES. Nintendo had the Super Scope, Genesis had the PAS, and so on and so forth. But the big thing at the time, especially in the late 80s, was the arrival of compact discs, or CDs for you young folks out there. And the CD-based platform was quickly overtaking the popularity of cassettes, 8-tracks, Betamax, stuff I'm sure most of you have never touched before, and so on. But this was becoming the new hot thing, and the greater storage capacity meant that games could have actual video, and of course be expanded upon far greater than they would with a simple cartridge. And both Nintendo and Sega wanted in. And Sega of course went with the Sega CD, a peripheral that would be attached to the system that would let it run CD-based games. And then Sega would also work on the 32X, which allowed for 32-bit cartridges. Nintendo, of course, saw this and wanted to follow suit. And I believe about 1988, Nintendo contacted this little company that none of you ever heard of called Sony. And Sony was tasked with developing a CD-based peripheral for the Super Nintendo. A Super Nintendo CD-ROM, if you will. And the idea was this peripheral would be attached to the SNES, and much like the Sega CD, it would let you play CD-based games on the SNES and still have the functionality for cartridges. There were rumors back then of a CD-based Mario game. I believe that was in the works, and I don't think it ever got more beyond just the prototype phase. And this was, of course, headed up by Ken Kutaragi, who wanted to basically make this as a way of, getting in with Nintendo and helping Sony expand. And everything was all well and good, except for one little snag. The contract that Sony and Nintendo agreed upon was Sony would develop this peripheral, it would be their own hardware, their own copyright. And they would also be given the option to take this and create a standalone console, a PlayStation, if you will. I don't think that name was ever going to catch on, do you? And this PlayStation would basically run the same games. So if you had the SNES and you buy the peripheral, you could play those games. If you just wanted the PlayStation, you could do that as well. Now here is the big point. When the contract was agreed upon, Sony would remain exclusive control over the PlayStation and the peripheral. What this meant was any licensees who wanted to develop a game for it would go to Sony because they were the developers of the platform, not Nintendo. And this included the peripheral as well. Nintendo was basically shut out. And they did not like that. As we talked about yesterday, the chairman at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, very much wanted to keep control 100% in Nintendo's eye, or Nintendo's corner. And Sony was not budging on it, despite coming up with a pretty decent prototype. This is one of the few recorded images or few recorded models of this kind of prototype for the Sony PlayStation. If you notice there is a Super Nintendo style controller there, with of course the CD functionality. And things were looking up for Sony, but Nintendo wasn't too happy. And then they decided to do something a little underhanded. They approached Philips, which was Sony's biggest competitor at the time, and tasked them with making a CD-based peripheral, or to work with them for CD-based games. And then the shoe basically dropped, as it were, in 1991 at the Consumer Electronics Show, or CES. Sony, of course, announced the PlayStation, this standalone peripheral that they was going to develop in partnership with Nintendo to allow for CD-based games on the SNES. The very next day, Nintendo announced their exclusive partnership with Philips to work with their CDI system to get Nintendo licensed games on there, and basically pretended they had no idea what they were doing with Sony. And that, my friends, is as big of a stab in the back as you can get in terms of companies working together. And Sony was pissed, as deservedly so. And they had two options: either give up on this whole video game business, or basically swear vendetta against Nintendo for the foreseeable future. And what they decided to do, of course, was the latter. So they took the hardware specs and the proprietary hardware that they developed and refashioned it and reconditioned it to be a standalone system. And then Sony decided to release the Sony PlayStation. Again, a name that never would have caught on, I think. I'm not sure any of you know what that name is, right? And that was released in 1994. Man, every time we do these historical pieces, I feel old at the end of them. And, of course, the PlayStation did beat the N64, the Nintendo 64, to market, which that came out in 1996. And the PlayStation kind of ushered in this era of the CD format. Well, of course, the Sega CD did okay, but it never really took on as big as the PlayStation. And of course, we saw stuff such as the Atari Jaguar, the 3DO, and I'm pretty sure there are a few more systems that I'm forgetting. And I'm sure what you're wondering right now is whatever happened with the Philips Nintendo partnership. Basically, what happened was absolute failure. While Sony's PlayStation, of course, this was still primitive 3D at the time, was still very much the cutting edge. However, and I'm warning you, I'm about to shock you here, this is what we got with the Philips CDI. That is, wow, that's just haunting to look at. First of all, that is from the CD Legend of Zelda game, and I think they released 3 of these on the Philips CDI, along with a Hotel Mario game. Besides looking just creepy, and let me get that off before we all have nightmares tonight, the game was horrible. It was not up to Nintendo's standards, and if there was any doubt that Nintendo wanted to keep their properties exclusive to them, this was pretty much the final nail in the coffin until at least the last few years with, of course, Pokemon Go, Fire Emblem Heroes, and stuff like that. But the Nintendo Philips partnership just dissolved. And this paved the way for the PlayStation to basically dominate the market. Ken Kuragi, of course, became a major person at Sony and helped to spearhead the PlayStation 2, 3, and so on. And that gets us back to the original topic, Nintendo's big mistake. If it wasn't for their hubris with wanting to retain control over everything, they could have had a very lucrative partnership with the PlayStation. And just think about this for a second. We were this close to having Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, and all the other big-name PlayStation 1 titles on a Nintendo system. Just imagine how the landscape would have changed if that was the case. would we have ever seen a solo Sony venture with the PlayStation, or would have kept with Nintendo? Again, these are all some hypothetical what ifs, but one thing would have been for sure: since Microsoft didn't step into the scene until the early thousands, this would have pretty much solidified Nintendo's rule of the industry for until at least the end of the decade. And who knows just how big Nintendo would have gotten if that was the case. Now, of course, with the PlayStation, what we saw was, again, the CD format just became very attractive. And if it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't have seen, of course, Resident Evil, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, or at least not in the forms that were developed. I remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong, for those of you watching this, that I think there was a time that they were hinting at Resident Evil on the N64. I'm pretty sure they were, but that could just have been a dream that I had at one point. Now, with Nintendo, instead of backing the CD format with Sony, they of course went with more cartridges with the N64. There were rumors and stirrings that they were going to create a hard drive, the Nintendo HDD, which would allow for CDs on the N64. But that never came around. Instead, we got the expansion pack that added more memory and made games look a little bit better. But Nintendo's basically, fight against the future, fight against the trends, basically submitted their downfall in the late 90s into the early thousands. With the rise of CD-based format, the PlayStation pretty much took over overnight as many of the big-name developers jumped ship. Famously, of course, was Square-Enix, who for pretty much about a decade were exclusively with Nintendo. Again, the big-name games, Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, and a few other big games for the Super Nintendo, which I'm blanking on at the moment. But when Final Fantasy VII was to be worked on, they wanted to use a CD for that due to all those FMVs or all those cinematic scenes. And of course, a cartridge just couldn't hold that. And while the PlayStation, of course, got Final Fantasy VII, one of the most recognizable games of all time, the Nintendo 64 got Quest 64. And please, if you're watching this, raise your hand if you actually play that game. And I'm pretty sure if I asked the same question on Final Fantasy, everyone would have their arms up right now. But to wrap up today's critical thought, Nintendo basically betraying Sony is arguably the biggest mistake they've ever made. This is one of those mistakes that you pretty much wake up, in a fever, sweating profusely over the decision you made. And sadly, this is a decision that, as we've seen over the last 17 years, Nintendo has not managed to come back from. Now, with that said, of course, Nintendo has certainly gone their own way. And when we come back to Nintendo in a little bit, probably, I guess, Thursday or so, we'll talk about how Nintendo basically decided to go against the grain going forward, with some mistakes, some partial successes, and then I believe for Friday, or maybe we'll try to wrap this up on Thursday, we'll talk also about Nintendo's big transitional period, how things changed in 2002 and going forward under Satoru Iwata and the arrival of Reggie Fils-Aimé. But with that said, let's wrap things up for today. As always, thank you so much for enjoying these videos. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're new. You have 1 day left in February to get in your donations for the Patreon. We're just under halfway to our first goal, so be sure to check that out. Patreon, I think, /GW Bycer, and there's of course links everywhere to it. If there's any topics you'd like me to cover with Nintendo either this week or beyond, please let me know in the comments below. Like I said, for tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the Xbox Game Pass and what this whole streaming service could mean for video games going forward. But until then, be sure to check back daily for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I'm still Josh Bycer, and until tomorrow, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.